600,000 men marched into Russia behind Napoleon Bonaparte in the summer of 1812. Fewer than 50,000 ever marched back out. For 200 years, no one knew for certain what really killed the rest. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the island of Corsica on August 15, 1769, just months after France annexed the island from the Republic of Genoa. He came from a family of minor Italian nobility, and French was not even his first language when he was growing up. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent away to a military school in mainland France, where the other boys mocked his thick Corsican accent and his poor French. He trained as an artillery officer and graduated in 1785, ranked 42nd in his class of 58. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, he tore down the old monarchy and threw open the door for ambitious young officers like Napoleon. Napoleon first made his name in 1793 at the siege of Toulon, where his clever placement of cannons drove a British fleet right out of the harbor. The victory earned him a promotion all the way to a brigadier general at just 24 years old. In 1796, Napoleon married Josephine de Beauharnais, and only days later took command of the entire French army in Italy. His lightning campaigns across Italy and the bold expedition to Egypt turned Napoleon into the most famous soldier in all of France. In 1799, Napoleon seized power in a coup and made himself first consul, effectively the ruler of France. Then in 1804, Napoleon placed a golden crown on his own head and declared himself Emperor of the French. By 1811, his empire stretched across most of Europe, from Spain in the west all the way to the borders of Russia in the east. So why would the most powerful man in Europe march his armies into the endless vastness of Russia? The real reason was an economic war against Britain called the continental system. Napoleon had banned almost all of Europe from trading with Britain, hoping to strangle the British economy until it surrendered. But Russia depended on selling its grain and timber to the British, so Tsar Alexander I quietly broke the blockade and reopened trade. To Napoleon, this open betrayal by the Russian Tsar simply could not go unpunished. So in the summer of 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest invasion force that Europe had ever seen. On June 24, 1812, the Grand Army began crossing the Niemen River into Russian territory. The army numbered roughly 600,000 soldiers, drawn from France and more than a dozen allied nations across Europe. It was so enormous that it took several days just for the entire force to finish crossing the river. Napoleon expected a single quick and decisive battle that would force Tsar Alexander to surrender within a matter of weeks. But the Russian army flatly refused to give Napoleon the battle he wanted. Instead, the Russian army did something Napoleon never expected. It retreated deeper and deeper into its own country. As they fell back, Russian forces burned their own crops, villages, and food stores so the advancing French would find nothing to eat. This scorched earth strategy slowly turned the endless Russian countryside into a death trap. The Grand Armee marched hundreds of miles inland, but its supply line stretched dangerously thin behind it. Soldiers were already dying of hunger, exhaustion, and disease long before any major battle had ever been fought. Finally, on September 7, 1812, the Russians turned to fight at the village of Borodino, about 70 miles west of Moscow. The Battle of Borodino became the single bloodiest day of the entire Napoleonic Wars. For 12 straight hours, more than 250,000 men fought with muskets, bayonets, and hundreds of roaring cannons. By nightfall, roughly 70,000 men lay dead or wounded on the field in a single day. Napoleon won the battle, but the Russian army slipped away intact. And now, the road to Moscow lay wide open. On September 14, 1812, Napoleon marched triumphantly into Moscow, certain that the war was finally won. But he found the great city almost completely deserted, its people gone. And that very night, fires broke out all across Moscow, deliberately set by the retreating Russians themselves. Over the next 4 days, roughly 3/4 of the entire city burned to the ground. Napoleon lingered in the smoke and ruins of Moscow for 5 weeks, sending repeated offers of peace to the Tsar. Tsar Alexander refused to send back even a single reply. With winter closing in and no food left in the ruined city, Napoleon was finally forced to order a full retreat. On October 19, 1812, the Grand Armee began the long march back toward France. What followed became one of the most catastrophic military retreats in all of recorded history. An early and brutal Russian winter descended on the column, with temperatures plunging to -40 degrees. Soldiers froze to death in their sleep, and horses collapsed and died by the thousands along the road. Starving men were reduced to butchering their own dead horses and eating the meat raw. Russian Cossack cavalry shadowed the column relentlessly, cutting down any soldier who fell behind. In late November, the shattered army reached the Berezina river, only to find that its bridges had been destroyed. French engineers waded into the freezing ice-choked water to build makeshift pontoon bridges by hand. As Russian artillery opened fire, thousands of panicking soldiers and civilians were crushed or drowned trying to force their way across. The crossing of the Berezina alone cost tens of thousands of lives in just a few days. By the time the survivors finally staggered out of Russia in December 1812, the Grand Armee had been all but destroyed. Of the 600,000 men who had marched in, fewer than 50,000 ever came back out. Napoleon himself had already abandoned the army, racing back to Paris in a sleigh to hold on to his power. The invasion of Russia shattered the myth that Napoleon Bonaparte was unbeatable. 3 years later, Napoleon was defeated for good at Waterloo and died in exile on the remote island of St. Helena in 1821. The Russian campaign still stands as one of the greatest military catastrophes in all of human history. For 200 years, one question hung over the entire disaster. What actually killed most of those soldiers? Historians had always blamed a single disease above all others, and that disease was typhus. Typhus is caused by a bacterium called Rickettsia prowazekii, spread by body lice, and it thrives in exactly the filthy crowded conditions of a retreating army. Back in 2006, an earlier study of the soldiers' remains claimed to find genetic traces of typhus and trench fever. For years afterward, that seemed to finally settle the question of what had destroyed the Grand Armee. But the science of ancient DNA was about to become far more powerful than anyone in 2006 had imagined. The key to solving the mystery lay in a mass grave in Vilnius, the capital of modern-day Lithuania. Vilnius sat directly on the road that Napoleon's army had used during its desperate retreat. Thousands of soldiers died there of cold and disease and were buried together in enormous pits. The grave was rediscovered by accident in 2001 when construction workers uncovered a tangle of human bones. It is believed to hold the remains of as many as 2,000 to 3,000 of Napoleon's soldiers. In 2025, a team led by the geneticist Nicolas Rascovan at the Institute of Pasteur in Paris re-examined the Vilnius remains. Using the modern DNA sequencing, the scientists analyzed the tooth pulp of 13 of the buried soldiers. Teeth are ideal for this because their sealed inner pulp preserves the DNA of whatever was in the person's blood at the moment they died. The technique, called shotgun metagenomics, reads every single fragment of genetic material in a sample all at once. This let the scientists search for any pathogens at all, not just the ones they already expected to find. Their findings were first shared online in July 2025 and formally published in the journal Current Biology that October. The results overturned 2 full centuries of assumption. In all 13 of the soldiers, there was no trace of typhus whatsoever. Instead, the DNA revealed 2 completely different diseases that nobody had ever confirmed before. The first one was Salmonella enterica, the bacterium that causes paratyphoid fever, a severe intestinal infection spread through contaminated food and water. In the filthy, starving conditions of retreat, paratyphoid fever would have torn through the ranks with ease. The second disease was Borrelia recurrentis, which caused loose-borne relapsing fever, marked by repeated waves of burning fever. Both diseases had been silently circulating through the army. killing men that the cold and hunger had already left defenseless. This discovery does far more than simply correct an old medical mystery. It shows that the collapse of the Grand Armee was not caused by one single villain, but the many overlapping disasters striking all at once. Cold, starvation, exhaustion, and at least 2 separate epidemics all hit the same doomed army together. It also proves just how far the science of ancient DNA has come in only 20 years. A disease that vanished from the battlefield 2 centuries ago can now be identified from a single preserved tooth. And it raises a genuinely unsettling question. If historians were wrong about this for 200 years, how many other subtle facts of history are we still getting wrong today? New tools are quietly letting scientists reopen the past, one grave at a time. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more history that turned out to be completely wrong.